Ethan Brooks, a retired Navy SEAL, discovers a battered man in the northern Washington wilderness. Recognizing a fellow soldier's haunted gaze, Ethan builds a shelter, staying by the man's side through a frozen night. At dawn, Marines arrive, revealing the man as Sam Dalton, a presumed dead Marine from a classified mission. As they salute Dalton's return, Ethan's quiet loyalty unearths a forgotten hero. But questions linger. Why was Dalton left behind? What secrets does he carry? The forest holds its silence, but Ethan's actions spark a mystery that could unravel a hidden past, leaving readers craving answers. This story of loyalty and sacrifice needs your support. Like, subscribe, and share to honor heroes like Ethan and Sam. Drop a comment about a time you stood by someone overlooked. Your story could inspire others. Join our channel to keep these powerful tales alive. Stay kind, stay strong. Then Brooks carried the weight of war in every step, a man sculpted by silence and hardened by memories that lingered like smoke. At 42, his salt and pepper hair hinted at years his lean frame seemed to defy, though a faint limp betrayed the toll of 18 years as a Navy SEAL. Those years had carved habits into him, scanning doorways for threats, reading shadows for danger, and guarding trust like a rare currency. When he retired, the world offered him two paths: the clamor of city streets or the quiet of wilderness. Cities, with their honking horns and restless crowds, felt like a battlefield he no longer had the strength to fight. So he chose solitude, packing his life, sparse as it was, into a truck and driving to the rugged folds of northern Washington. There, where mountains loomed like ancient sentinels and pines whispered secrets to the wind, he built a cabin by hand. No power lines, no faucets, just a wood stove's warmth and a porch that gazed into endless forest. The eagle's cries and the river's murmur were his only company, and that was enough. Here, the world didn't demand he relive the past. Here, he could breathe without paying a price. For Ethan, isolation wasn't a punishment, it was a balm. War left wounds no one could see, triggers buried in the screech of tires or the pop of fireworks. Crowded places stirred memories he fought to bury, sending his pulse racing without warning. The wilderness, though, was kind. It didn't judge his scars or ask why he flinched at sudden sounds. It offered a peace that cities never could. Trust, once given freely, now came with a price. He didn't shun the world out of anger. He loved its beauty too much to watch it fracture. On rare trips to town for supplies, he was a ghost, polite but distant, known only as the man from the mountains. Neighbors, few and far between, respected his space. Ethan's cabin was his sanctuary, a testament to skills honed long before his first deployment. Its simplicity suited him, a life stripped to essentials where silence mended what war had broken. That morning, the air was sharp with winter's approach, each breath a puff of frost. Ethan led a small hiking group up a trail he knew as well as his own heartbeat, his boots moving with the quiet grace of a predator. Among them was his cousin Tyler, a Chicago transplant whose chatter felt like a radio left on in a quiet room. Tyler's enthusiasm was endearing, his city-bred curiosity a stark contrast to the forest stillness. Ethan didn't mind. Tyler was family, a reminder of a world he'd left but hadn't forgotten. The trail was his domain, every bend, every route memorized. So when he spotted fresh drag marks near a sharp curve, pine needles strewn and branches cracked, his senses snapped to life. His pulse didn't quicken. It steadied, years of training flooding back. He scanned the trees, his eyes cutting through the dawn's soft light with surgical precision. "Go on to the viewpoint," he told the group, his voice a low command wrapped in calm. "I'll catch up." Tyler's city instincts kicked in, his frown heavy with worry. "What's wrong?" Ethan's lips curved, a ghost of a smile. "Probably nothing, but I'd rather know for sure." He didn't wait for protests, slipping off the trail with a predator's grace. Each step was measured, his boots barely disturbing the earth. The signs, scattered soil, a faint path of snapped twigs, drew him deeper into the woods. Doubt crept in, a familiar companion. Could be a trap, his mind warned, the old paranoia stirring. He might be playing you, but Ethan had faced darker unknowns. "I've jumped into fire for my brothers," he whispered, his voice steady as stone. "These woods don't scare me." Under a towering pine, he found him, a man broken by the world. His clothes hung in tatters, his hands scraped bloody and raw, his body hunched against the cold. But his eyes, they unease. They told a different tale, not of defeat but of defiance, the kind only a soldier carries. Ethan's guard didn't drop, but something stirred, recognition, not of the man but of the weight he bore. Kneeling, Ethan's hands moved with quiet efficiency, weaving branches and tarp into a shelter against the biting cold. The stranger watched, his gaze heavy with stories he didn't share. Ethan didn't ask. He didn't need to. Through the long, frozen night, he stayed. The stranger's shallow breaths a faint rhythm in the dark. Ethan's thoughts wandered to his SEAL days, nights in hostile lands, guarding men who'd become family. This stranger was no brother, but out here under the stars, that line blurred. Duty didn't ask for names. Dawn broke, soft gold spilling through the pines. Ethan stepped outside, his body stiff from the cold, but his mind clear. Then he stopped, his breath catching. Along the path to his cabin stood dozens of Marines, their dress blues a stark contrast to the forest's green. Silent, they saluted, a pathway of flags unfurled at their feet. Ethan's chest tightened, not with fear, but with something deeper. Pride, pain, brotherhood. The stranger wasn't just a man lost in the woods. He was one of theirs, honored by those who'd come for him. Ethan didn't know his story, but he felt its weight. In that moment, the man who'd fled the world to find peace stood tall, the forest quiet giving way to the unspoken bond of those who'd served. In the dense wilderness, where shadows clung to the towering pines, Ethan moved with the silent precision of a man who had once navigated hostile territories half a world away. His steps were measured, muscle memory guiding him through the underbrush, each motion a quiet echo of missions long past. About 50 yards into the forest, he found the source of his unease. An elderly man, frail and shivering, pressed against the rough bark of a pine tree. The man's clothes hung in tatters, his hands were bloodied and raw, and his face bore the flush of exposure's early grip. But it wasn't the physical toll that stopped Ethan in his tracks. It was the man's eyes. They were sharp, haunted, and unyielding, carrying the weight of battles seen and survived. Ethan knew that look. It wasn't just the mark of a lost soul wandering too far from a trail. It was the unmistakable stamp of a soldier. The set of his shoulders, rigid despite his frailty, and the way his gaze darted, never lingering too long on any one point, betrayed a life shaped by conflict. Ethan recognized it instantly. As one warrior always knows another, no matter how time or circumstance tries to bury the truth. Kneeling carefully, Ethan softened his approach, his movements deliberate, respectful. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice low and steady, offering a water flask from his pack. The old man's trembling fingers reached for it, his grip weak but desperate, as though the simple act of drinking was a reclaiming of something long lost. As the water touched his lips, Ethan saw gratitude flicker in those battle-worn eyes, a fleeting acknowledgement of safety after what must have felt like an eternity of vulnerability. In that moment, Ethan understood this was no ordinary rescue. This encounter was something deeper, a collision of two lives bound by shared scars, destined to shift the course of both their paths. As twilight draped the forest in a heavy veil, the wilderness took on an almost sacred mystery, softening edges and amplifying the unknown. Ethan wasted no time, his focus sharpening as he turned to the man he'd found. With the efficiency of someone who had built shelters under far worse conditions, he gathered what little he had, broken branches, a tattered tarp salvaged from his gear, and began constructing a makeshift refuge. It wasn't about creating something grand. It was about survival, a fragile barrier against the biting cold that crept in as the sun sank below the horizon. Each motion was deliberate, his hands steady despite the memories that flickered unbidden in his mind. Images of dusty outposts, of comrades lost, of moments when survival hinged on the smallest acts of care. The shelter, when finished, was crude but functional, a thin shield against the encroaching night. It offered a fleeting sense of security, a quiet promise that they could endure until morning. Inside, the space was cramped, lit only by the faint glow of a small fire Ethan had coaxed to life. The sputtering embers cast dancing shadows, their warmth a delicate counterpoint to the chill that pressed against the tarp. The old man sat in silence, his weathered face a map of unspoken trials, the firelight catching in his eyes like fragments of a life he was reluctant to revisit. There was a dignity in his stillness, a stubborn pride that refused to be extinguished by time or hardship. Ethan watched him closely, his own heart heavy with the weight of recognition. He knew the toll of carrying memories too vast for words, the way they could hollow a man out while leaving his resolve intact. The night stretched on, each hour marked by the rustle of wind through the pines or the sharp snap of a distant twig, reminders of the wilderness's unpredictability. Ethan kept watch, his senses attuned to every sound, his presence a steady anchor for the man beside him. In quiet tones, he offered reassurance, sharing water and small rations from his pack. Between moments of silence, he spoke of camaraderie forged in the crucible of war, of loyalty that outlasted the battlefield. The words weren't just for the old man, they were for Ethan too, a way to tether himself to the humanity he'd fought to preserve through years of conflict. The old man listened, his eyes occasionally meeting Ethan's, and in those fleeting glances there was an unspoken understanding, a bond forged not in words but in the shared weight of survival. In the fragile shelter, surrounded by the vast, indifferent wilderness, Ethan felt the night teaching them both something profound. The darkness, with its whispers of wind and shadow, became a silent mentor, reminding them that solace often lies in the quiet acts of care, offering water, building a fire, staying vigilant through the long hours. It was a testament to the unspoken connection between soldiers, a thread that held fast even when everything else fell away. As the fire burned low, its embers barely clinging to life, the first light of dawn began to filter through the thick canopy above. Ethan, exhausted but resolute, watched as the old man stirred beneath the rough shelter. His breathing, once shallow and unsteady, had found a rhythm. For the first time since Ethan had found him, there was a spark of clarity in his eyes, a faint return of the man he had once been. Slowly grimacing against the stiffness in his joints, the old man sat up, his gaze settling on Ethan with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, of the lifeline they had become for each other in the heart of the wild. The door groaned as Ethan Brooks pulled it open, revealing a formidable wall of military uniforms, their fabric sharp and unyielding in the pale morning light. Leading them was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Harrington, his silver oak leaves catching the dawn's faint glow like stars pinned to his collar. His stance was rigid, a portrait of discipline, but his face, half hidden beneath his dress cover's brim, held an enigma of emotions, duty, perhaps, or something softer, more human. "Mr. Brooks," he said, his voice formal yet threaded with respect. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Harrington, United States Marine Corps. We're here about the man you've been sheltering." Behind him, rows of Marines stood in perfect formation, their faces stoic, eyes locked forward in a silent tribute. Ethan didn't step aside immediately. His gaze darted back to Sam Dalton, who lingered in the cabin's dim interior. Dalton's eyes churned with a tempest of fear and confusion, a faint flicker of hope battling the weight of years spent in exile. Ethan's jaw clenched. He wouldn't let these men reduce Dalton to a subject of discussion, a name on a report. "You'll speak to him," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the chill like a honed edge. "Not over him, not about him, to him." With that, he swung the door wider, opening not just the cabin but a chapter of a man's life that had been sealed shut for 13 long years. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. The Marines outside held their salutes, a wall of respect that rooted the clearing in reverence. Harrington stepped forward, his movements precise, and in a rare act of vulnerability, he removed his cover. It was a small gesture, but it stripped away the armor of his uniform, revealing the man beneath. Inside, Sam Dalton stood frozen, gripping a worn blanket around his shoulders like a shield against the unknown. His body was taut, torn between the instinct to flee and a deeper, fragile hope that someone, anyone, had finally come for him. His mind raced with questions he couldn't voice. Why now? After all these years, could this be real? Slowly, painfully, he rose, each movement a struggle against the weight of his past. Ethan stayed close, a silent anchor, offering no pressure, only the space for Dalton to claim this moment. This wasn't Ethan's to control. It belonged to Sam, to whatever part of him still dared to believe he had a place in the world. Dalton shuffled toward the doorway, each step a quiet war between fear and resolve. When he reached the threshold, he stood framed by the rough-hewn wood, his silhouette frail but unyielding. Harrington snapped a crisp salute. "Welcome home, Colonel Dalton," he said, his voice steady but thick with unspoken emotion. The Marines behind him followed, their boots striking the earth in a soft, synchronized rhythm that filled the clearing. Dalton's lips parted, but words failed him. His hand, trembling yet resolute, rose in return. The salute was imperfect, its precision eroded by years of hardship, but it carried a weight no metal could rival. To those watching, it was a testament to survival, a man who had fought his way back from the edge of oblivion. A young Marine, barely old enough to know the world Dalton once belonged to, stepped forward, his face raw with emotion. "My father served with you, sir," he said, his voice hoarse. "He said you saved his life. He told me if I ever had the chance, I was to stand for you." The words struck Dalton like a tide, stirring something long buried. His eyes, dulled by pain and survival, glistened with unshed tears. For the first time in over a decade, he wasn't a ghost wandering forgotten woods. He was seen. He was remembered. He was home. The silence that had cloaked the clearing began to fracture, giving way to hushed, urgent conversations. Ethan lingered by the porch, arms crossed, his eyes sharp and unyielding. Trust was hard-won, and uniforms alone didn't earn it. He watched every gesture, every glance, weighing the intentions of these men who had come to reclaim a piece of their history. Inside, a team of medical officers tended to Dalton with a reverence reserved for sacred things. They checked his vitals with gentle precision, offered clean clothes, and prepared transport with a care that spoke of awe. To them, Dalton wasn't just a veteran, he was a living relic, a man reclaimed from the shadows of a war that had tried to erase him. Harrington pulled Ethan aside, his voice low. "We've been searching for him for a long time," he said. "Officially, Recon Team Echo was declared KIA, but some of us never stopped believing there was more to the story." He spoke of fragmented intelligence that surfaced months after Dalton's unit vanished, hints of a survivor who might have escaped captivity deep behind enemy lines. Political shame and bureaucratic inertia had buried the truth, sealed away by classified missions. But Harrington's tone grew resolute. "Some of us made a vow. If there was even a chance he was out there, we'd keep looking." For him, it was personal, a debt to a man who had become a legend in whispers, a symbol of those they couldn't leave behind. As Ethan crouched beside the fire, the stranger's gaze shifted toward him, sharp and piercing, cutting through the dim light of the makeshift shelter. It wasn't the wary glance of a lost wanderer, but the deliberate, calculating stare of a soldier evaluating another. The man's eyes, though sunken from exhaustion, flicked over Ethan's frame, his steady posture, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his hands moved with purpose, betraying years of disciplined training. It was a look that stripped away pretense, one that saw beyond civilian clothes and quiet demeanor. The stranger's shoulders squared instinctively, despite the tremor in his limbs, as if his body remembered a strength his current state could barely summon. His voice, rough and cracked from disuse, broke the silence. "You were in Romani, weren't you?" The words hit Ethan like a sudden gust of winter wind, sharp and unrelenting. He froze, his breath catching in his chest. He hadn't spoken of Romani, not to anyone. Not the endless nights under a sky torn apart by gunfire. Not the weight of decisions that left scars deeper than any bullet could. He wore no insignia, no telltale signs of his past. Yet this man, this broken figure huddled in a tattered coat, had seen through him in an instant. It wasn't a question, it was a recognition, a quiet acknowledgement from someone who had walked the same blood-soaked paths, who knew the indelible mark or left on a soul. Ethan's heart thudded, a mix of unease and something softer, something like kinship. Soldiers carried an unspoken language, etched in the way they scanned a room for threats, the way their bodies stayed coiled even in moments of rest, always ready for a danger that might never come. No medals or uniforms were needed to spot it. It was in the eyes, always searching, always haunted. Ethan knelt beside the man, offering a tin cup of water, his movements deliberate to mask the storm of emotions rising within him. The man's hand shook as he accepted it, but his eyes held Ethan's with a clarity that belied his frail state. "You're safe now," Ethan said, his voice low, steady, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile thread forming between them. "Rest will get you home." The words felt inadequate, but they carried a promise Ethan hadn't known he'd make. A vow born not of duty, but of something deeper, something that stirred in the quiet spaces of his heart. For the man, the water wasn't just sustenance. It was a lifeline, a gesture that tethered him back to a world that had long since turned its back on him. His trembling fingers gripped the cup, and in his gaze a flicker of trust began to take root, delicate but undeniable. For Ethan, this moment wasn't about survival or obligation. It was about the silent understanding that no matter how far someone falls, there's always someone who remembers what it means to stand. As dawn broke, the morning sun spilled over the treetops, casting golden light across the battered shelter and its two unlikely occupants. The warmth did little to soften the harsh edges of their reality, but it illuminated something eternal in Ethan's mind. Some bonds are forged in blood, others in the quiet choice to stay when the world moves on. By mid-morning, the fire had dwindled to smoldering embers, and Ethan busied himself preparing a simple breakfast. Oatmeal and black coffee, the kind of meal that sustains soldiers through long, unforgiving days. The familiar ritual grounded him, a small act of normalcy in a moment that felt anything but. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught movement. The man who had introduced himself as Gabriel fumbled with the frayed edges of his jacket. Something metallic clinked against the wooden floor, half buried in dirt and tattered fabric. Ethan's instincts kicked in, and he reached down, his fingers brushing against cold metal. He lifted a pair of battered dog tags, their edges worn but the engraving still legible. The name stamped into them stopped him cold. Dalton Samuel, 1st Recon, USMC. A flood of memories surged unbidden. Whispers in dimly lit mess halls, fragmented stories of a blacked-out operation gone wrong. A recon team, presumed dead, lost to the shadows of secrecy. Samuel Dalton, a Marine declared KIA over a decade ago, his name buried under layers of classified reports and political expediency. Ethan's grip tightened around the tags, his knuckles whitening. This wasn't just a lost man he'd stumbled upon in the woods. This was a ghost, a soldier the world had erased, left to wander in the margins of existence. Ethan knelt beside Dalton's son, whose eyes met his with a raw, haunted intensity. The weight of years spent unseen, unacknowledged, lingered in that gaze, a silent scream of betrayal and resilience. "How long?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the truth might shatter if spoken too loudly. Dalton's eyes drifted to the endless stretch of trees beyond the shelter, their branches swaying in the morning breeze. "They left us there," he rasped, his voice thick with grief. "Extraction went wrong. I crawled. Don't know how long. Days, maybe weeks. The world stopped making sense." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, laden with the pain of abandonment, the sting of betrayal, and yet, beneath it all, an unyielding spark of survival. Ethan's chest ached as he placed the dog tags back into Dalton's trembling hands, their cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of his touch. "You're not forgotten," he said, the words carrying a weight he hadn't anticipated. For the first time since Ethan had found him, Dalton's composure broke. Tears welled in his eyes, not from weakness, but from the release of a burden too heavy to carry alone. They were the tears of a man who had fought to survive, not just against the elements, but against the crushing weight of being erased. For Ethan, the moment crystallized a truth he had always known, but never articulated. Some battles don't end on the battlefield. They linger in the quiet moments, in the shared glances of those who understand, in the choice to see someone the world has forgotten. The weight of years lost in the wilderness clung to Sam Dalton like a shadow, but the realization that someone still remembered him, after all this time, struck him with a force that left him trembling. His tears, raw and unbidden, had finally quieted, leaving the small cabin steeped in a fragile stillness. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic crackle of the fire in the hearth, and the distant, mournful sigh of the wind weaving through the forest outside. The air inside was heavy with the unspoken, a mix of warmth from the flames and the lingering ache of memories too painful to touch. Ethan Brooks moved through the cramped space with a quiet purpose. his every step deliberate, as if he understood that some wounds were too raw to be prodded. He didn't press Dalton for answers or demand explanations for the haunted look in the man's eyes. Instead, he tended to the small chores of the cabin, stoking the fire, adjusting a blanket, boiling water, with the careful reverence of someone who knew that healing couldn't be forced. It had to be coaxed, trusted to unfurl in its own time. Ethan's silence wasn't cold or distant. It was a presence, a steady hand extended into the dark, offering Dalton something solid to hold on to without asking him to bare his soul. Dalton slept fitfully through the day, curled beneath a thick wool blanket near the fire's glow. His face, weathered by years of hardship, twisted now and then in the grip of invisible nightmares. Each grimace spoke of terrors buried deep, memories of betrayal, of battles fought and lost, of promises shattered like glass. Ethan stayed near, never hovering, never crowding, but close enough that Dalton wouldn't feel the weight of his demons alone. He sat in a worn wooden chair, his broad shoulders relaxed but his eyes sharp, scanning the man before him with a mix of pity and resolve. Ethan knew what it was to carry ghosts. He'd carried his own for years. But watching Dalton wrestle with his, he felt a quiet determination settle in his chest. This man would not be left to drown in his past. As night fell, the forest outside grew colder, darker, its shadows pressing against the cabin's thin walls. Ethan added another log to the fire, the flames casting flickering light across the room. He settled into the chair across from Dalton, his rifle leaning against the wall nearby, a relic of old habits that never quite faded. But Ethan's true strength wasn't in the weapon, it was in his presence, a quiet, unyielding anchor in a world that had long since stopped offering stability to men like Dalton. He sat there, his gaze steady, his breathing even, as if his very existence could hold the fractured pieces of Dalton's life in place. Not all rescues come with sirens or gunfire. Some are quiet, patient acts of defiance against the darkness, sitting through the storm, raging in another man's mind, offering no solutions, no platitudes, just the stubborn proof that someone will stay, no matter how heavy the weight of the night becomes. Around midnight, Dalton stirred violently in his sleep, his body thrashing against the comb as fragmented words spilled from his lips. Coordinates, signals gone wrong, promises broken in the heat of some long-forgotten mission. His voice was a jagged whisper, laced with panic and guilt. Ethan didn't move to touch him. He knew better than to pull a man like Dalton from his nightmares by force. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice low and steady, the way you'd speak to a wounded brother in the chaos of a battlefield. "You're safe, Sam," he murmured into the shadowed room, his words a lifeline tossed into the dark. "You're not alone." The storm in Dalton's mind seemed to ease at the sound, his thrashing slowing, his breathing settling into a ragged rhythm. Sweat glistened on his forehead, catching the firelight, but he didn't wake. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but never closing. He couldn't afford to sleep, not when Dalton's peace was so fragile. Outside, the wind rose, weaving through the pines with a sound like the ghosts of battles long past, whispering secrets the forest had kept for years. But inside the cabin, there was only the steady rhythm of two men breathing, one fighting to claw his way back to who he was, and the other refusing to let him face that battle alone. In the quiet of that long, frozen night, Ethan made a silent vow, carved deep into his soul. Sam Dalton, broken as he was, would not be abandoned again. Not on his watch. When morning broke, it came gray and cold, the mist thick and heavy between the trees, cloaking the world in a shroud of silence. Ethan moved through the familiar ritual of brewing coffee, the rich, earthy scent filling the cabin's small interior, a small act of normalcy in a world that felt anything but. Across the room, Dalton stirred on the cot, his muttering soft but relentless. Fragments of missions, names of men long gone, codes the world had forgotten. His voice was a ghost of itself, carrying the weight of years spent running, hiding, surviving. Ethan poured 2 mugs of coffee, setting one quietly on the rough-hewn table beside Dalton's cot, the steam curling upward like a prayer. Then he heard it, a low rumble, faint at first, then growing louder, unmistakable. The sound of engines climbing the narrow mountain road. Ethan's body stiffened, every instinct honed by years of war snapping into sharp focus. No one came up here without a reason. He crossed to the window, his movements swift but controlled, and pulled back the tattered curtain just enough to peer out. Through the drifting mist, dark shapes emerged. Olive-drab vehicles, their outlines stark and familiar. Military transport trucks, SUVs, a convoy. Ethan's hand tightened around the curtain, his jaw clenching. These weren't local law enforcement or park rangers. These were Marines. The cabin door rattled with a heavy knock, 3 firm, deliberate beats that echoed through the wood like a warning. Dalton jolted awake, his eyes wide with fear, his hand instinctively groping for a weapon that wasn't there. The panic in his gaze was raw, a man cornered by ghosts he couldn't outrun. "It's all right," Ethan said, his voice calm but unyielding, holding Dalton's gaze with a steadiness that promised protection. "You're safe. I won't let anyone hurt you." In moments like these, old soldiers don't think. They react, fight, flight, or stand their ground. But Ethan knew that standing your ground wasn't always about drawing a weapon. Sometimes it was about holding fast to the trust you'd earned, refusing to let it be torn away. His hand rested briefly on the door handle, steadying himself, his heart a steady drumbeat, against the uncertainty of what lay beyond. Whatever came next, he would face it, not just for himself, but for the man who'd been lost too long and deserved a chance to be found. The weight of a promise can shift the world, even if no one else notices. For Ethan Brooks, that promise was a vow made years ago, whispered in the chaos of war, to bring Sam Dalton home. Not just to retrieve a soldier, but to honor a brother whose name had faded from official records, erased by time and bureaucracy. Operation Homebound wasn't a mission that glittered with medals or headlines. It was a quiet pact, passed like a sacred relic among the few who still remembered. For Ethan, it was a fire that burned in his chest, a stubborn refusal to let the world forget. Loyalty, he'd learned, wasn't about following orders. It was about holding fast to a bond when everyone else had moved on. As the medical team readied Sam Dalton for the journey to Walter Reed Medical Center, Ethan stood apart, his boots rooted to the earth. His eyes met Sam's, and in that fleeting glance, a universe of unspoken words passed between them. Sam's face, weathered by 13 years of captivity and loss, held a gratitude too deep for words. His nod was small, almost imperceptible, but to Ethan it was everything. A silent acknowledgement of a debt repaid, a brotherhood restored. Ethan's heart thudded with a mix of relief and sorrow. Sam had been lost to the world, his existence scrubbed from history. But today, because of one man's unrelenting resolve, he was going home. The world would have to reckon with Sam Dalton's return, whether it wanted to or not. Ethan felt the weight of those 13 years in his bones as he watched the convoy disappear down the mountain road. He thought the chapter had closed, that he could finally lay the mission to rest. To returning to his quiet life, he fell back into the rhythm of simple routines, splitting firewood with methodical swings, walking the familiar trails that wound through the valley, brewing coffee so strong it could wake the dead. But beneath the surface, something lingered. A restless hum, like the echo of a song he couldn't quite place. The story, he sensed, wasn't over. 3 days later, at the precise moment when dawn's first light pierced the mist curling low across the valley, Ethan heard it, the faint crunch of tires on gravel. He stepped onto his porch, expecting the mundane, a delivery truck, maybe a lost hunter. But what he saw stopped him cold. Emerging from the forest's edge was a line of Marines, their dress blues sharp against the soft gray morning. No vehicles, no barking orders, just a silent procession of men standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces etched with reverence. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His arms crossed instinctively over his chest, as if to brace himself against the swell of emotion rising within him. One by one, the Marines approached. Each knelt at the trail leading to Ethan's porch, pressing a small American flag into the dirt. The act was deliberate, almost ritualistic. A quiet salute followed, their hands rising and falling in unison. No words spoken, no explanation needed. Ethan stood motionless, the rough wood of the porch grounding him as he watched. His chest tightened with a feeling he hadn't known in years, pride, raw and unfiltered, laced with a sorrow that cut deep. And beneath it all, something fragile stirred, something he'd thought long buried. Hope. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his eyes tracked every gesture, every flag planted, as if committing the scene to memory. Some debts, he realized, are paid not in grand gestures but in moments like this, sacred, unspoken rituals shared by those who understand loyalty without needing to name it. These men weren't here for glory or recognition. They were here because they knew what Ethan had done, what Sam Dalton had meant. They were here to honor a promise kept, a brother brought home. At the end of the line, a young Marine stepped forward, his face softer than the others, but no less resolute. Ethan's gaze lingered on him, and a flicker of recognition sparked. This was the son of a Sam had once saved, a life preserved in the crucible of war. The young man approached the porch and gently placed a framed photograph at Ethan's feet. It was an old image, faded but clear, a young Sam Dalton in uniform, standing tall in the sands of a distant desert, his eyes bright with the fire of youth. Ethan's throat tightened as he looked at it, memories flooding back of a time when they were all younger, when the world seemed simpler, when promises were made with the certainty they'd be kept. The Marine stood for one final moment, a heartbeat of silence that felt eternal. Then, as quietly as they'd come, they turned and melted back into the trees, leaving no trace but the trail of flags stretching from the forest to Ethan's door. A pathway of honor, each flag a testament to a sacrifice remembered, a loyalty unbroken. Ethan remained on the porch, his arms still crossed, his eyes fixed on the flags fluttering in the morning breeze. For the first time in years, a smile tugged at his lips, small, genuine, born of a quiet certainty. Some sacrifices, he knew now, are never truly forgotten, not as long as one person chooses to remember. In a world that races forward, where promises are often discarded like yesterday's news, Ethan Brooks stood as a reminder of what loyalty means. It's not about fanfare or accolades. It's about the small, steadfast choices, staying when it's easier to leave, believing in someone when the world has written them off. Ethan's story is a quiet challenge to a society that prizes convenience over commitment, that judges quickly and moves on faster. Would we stand by someone if no one else was watching? Would we hold fast to a promise when the world has forgotten it? In an age where people are quick to turn away from the broken or the lost, Ethan's resolve shines like a beacon. Some debts aren't written in ink but carved into the heart, obligations that endure beyond time or reason. What the world needs, now more than ever, are people like Ethan. Those who understand that true honor lies in the quiet acts, the unwavering choice to remember when everyone else has moved on.